Today on Call for Two, a spoiler-free review of Escape from the Asylum, an escape room puzzle game. With so many cool ideas and such a high production value, why can't I give this game an enthusiastic recommendation? And what advice would I give to new players? Stay tuned to find out. Some preliminaries first. This is a game in the escape room puzzle genre. That means that there are a bunch of puzzles with a sort of thin narrative thread. This game comes in two parts. Each part has 5 chapters. Each chapter will take you maybe an hour or two to play. It's not replayable. Once you finish it, you're done. But nothing gets destroyed while you play it, so you could trade it or give it away after you finish. It doesn't require the use of an app or internet. It was kickstarted in 2021, but is still being delivered to backers, as I understand it, as of 2023. I would say it's in the medium to hard range of puzzle games. It's listed with a recommended age of 12 and up, though I think you'd have a very hard time finding a 12-year-old that could handle the difficulty of puzzles here or would be interested in them. And it's currently selling for about $45. Now, before we get into the rest of the review, let me just point out that you can watch playthroughs on this channel of the entire game over the course of about 25 hours to play through all 10 chapters. And while this review will be spoiler-free, that playthrough obviously has spoilers, but also includes lots of discussion and opinion about each puzzle and whether we thought it was fair and our criticisms. So if you want a spoiler-filled review of the game after you play it, you might check out our playthroughs. So let's take a look inside the box and see what you get for your $45. Game is broken into 2 parts. Essentially, they're a continuing story. There are 5 or 6 characters, and in the first part, you play the first half of each of those characters' experience trying to escape this one single place, the asylum, and in part 2 you get their second half wrap-up of their stories. They're basically independent boxes, but the story continues. So we've got a very simple rule book, which does the job fine. Tells you how to reset the game when you're finished. That's what this list is. Helps you put everything back so you could give it to someone else. There's a map. So both of the boxes are sort of symmetric. Each box has a map that continues for that story. And then it's got a couple of timesheets that you could use to track how long it takes you to do each chapter, and then how to calculate a score based on how many hints you needed, how much time it took you, how many hints you needed, how often you had to go to read a solution. The basic structure of the game, of the puzzles, is actually in 2 parts, which is pretty cool, kind of unusual. We've seen lots of card-based puzzle games, and that's what we have here. So you sort of walk through the game. The puzzles are, you've got a thin narrative connective tissue that you use, that the cards guide you through, and then occasionally the card will tell you that you've arrived at some room in the asylum and that you should open that envelope. So you can see basically we've got our map. The map has all these different rooms, and then these envelopes represent those rooms. It's actually a very clever idea here. The fronts of the envelopes often show you some clues and pictures regarding the room. There's a very cool thing where the envelopes always show the front of the room with the door closed, and then the back sort of shows you, if you open the room, what you would see looking into it. It's not really used functionally for gameplay, but it's sort of the just another sign of the over-the-top production quality, and it's very enjoyable. So the structure basically is the first part, this first box, has 5 chapters. Each of those 5 chapters starts with one of these cards, 1 through 5. So for the first chapter, you'll turn over card 1 and start following instructions. Now I'm going to show you these first couple of cards from chapter 1. There's 10 chapters. These are the first cards you'd see. I'm not going to spoil anything important, just the first puzzle of many and the first set of narrative cards, just to give you some ideas. If you're really paranoid about spoilers, you might turn away, but I really think that would be a mistake. You should get a feel for what you're in for here. So a card shows you what character you're working with here. So this is story 1. This is the character. So as you pull cards from here, you'll always be looking at this. And for your first playthrough, your first game, first chapter, will always be this guy. So if you pick up a card that's not him, you know you've picked up the wrong card. It's a smart system. So this is very typical of the beginning of each of the 10 chapters. We start getting a narrative of this guy who's trying to escape the asylum. You see, you read this, then it tells you to pick the next card, 6, 7, 9, 1. You would look through this deck and get it. The deck is ordered sequentially. I've just brought these to the top. Here's the next card. The narrative continues. And then again, 7, 5, 6, 5. You'd find that card and bring it out. Narrative continues. And now it tells you, okay, take this next card and open the envelope for room 203. So you'd put this deck aside. And in this case, half the time you'll find the card will tell you, hey, get out this envelope, but don't open it. You have to solve a puzzle in order to open the door. And the other half of the puzzles just send you right into the room where you've got a puzzle. So it sets up this puzzle. It describes the rules of how to solve this puzzle. It's framed in this narrative. You're trying to unlock this door to get out. And we're going to open this room. I'm going to show you what's in this room. It's the most minimal of spoilers. It's the first puzzle of many. I really wouldn't worry about it. So you've got a little piece of information that feeds into the narrative, who you are. And then here's this little sheet that represents the playing pieces, the image that's going to help you solve this puzzle. And this is the challenge, to figure out what 4-digit code will unlock the door. So this describes what you're seeing. This shows you what you see. In this envelope, that's the full contents of the room, of the puzzle. It's this puzzle and this extra piece of information, but that's not always the case. Some envelopes will have lots of pieces, lots of parts. There's one envelope that's thick, bursting to the seams with parts. Sometimes there'll be multiple puzzles in an envelope. Sometimes there'll be objects that you keep. All of the puzzles are solved with a 4-digit code. We've seen this in other puzzle games. So once you figure out how to do this puzzle and you think you know the solution, you would then go to this deck and you would find that card that you think the solution is, whatever it is. You would turn it over if you find it. So if you find it, you've probably got it right. You turn it over and it says, yes, you unlock the door, or whatever you do, and you continue. Occasionally you'll get a card that says, no, you're wrong. But most often you just won't find the card you're looking for, and then you know, okay, I got it wrong. So that's how the game works. And then it'll direct you to go somewhere else. You're always following the instructions on the card. You can't choose where to go. You're always doing what it tells you. You're just following a linear story. Very rarely, occasionally, you'll be given a choice of something to do. It's rarely a case that you'll be able to make that decision based on logic. It'll just be a choice. Do you want to try to do it this way or try to do it this way? Some of those choices have narrative consequences. Some of those choices just have you do one puzzle rather than another. You'll play chapter 1, going through the cards, solving different puzzles until you get to a card that says that's the end or to be continued. And then you're done for the session. And you can put the game away after that session ends, and then when you come back, you'd play chapter 2. You'd take card 2 and start off, and that would give you a new character's story. And it would follow the same pattern. Probably starts out with 4 or 5 narrative card stories and then takes you to a room, and then from room to room. And each character, basically, you're guiding them to escape. After the first 5 chapters, you'll finish the first box, and then when you're ready, you'll open up the second box, and you'll play through chapters 6 through 10, which sort of wrap up each of these characters' story and an overarching story. That's the basic structure of the game. Okay, let's talk about some basic pros, some basic highlights of this game. First of all, there is a lot of bang for your buck in this box, in these 2 boxes. I think you can probably expect anywhere from 8 to 20 hours of gameplay, depending on how much you take your time. The production quality here is sort of off the charts in terms of over-the-top, unexpected stuff. Each of these envelopes contains different puzzles. They're all pre-cut, pre-sorted for you. There's some physical props in some of these, some plastic parts, lots of different pieces that go together. There's some things occasionally in here that feel like it's just shocking what was done here. There's a couple of these envelopes that have pieces that have been cut and folded and tucked in, and you sort of open them up because they're made to appear like a physical object. And you open up, and it's just to produce a little bit of a storyline or a photo, and it's shocking how much work went into producing and assembling. Really, it's the assembling that's so shocking here of some of these pieces. And when they didn't need to be done, that serves no functional purpose. So production quality is really uniformly good here. Another pro is that it's totally non-destructive, so you can pass this along and sell it. And the game really, a lot of these puzzle games almost are designed to be destructive so that you can't pass it along, so that they encourage more people to buy it. Here, they're really, the attitude is very generous. It's like, here's all this stuff, and we're going to work hard so you don't have to destroy any of it. There's also a lot of variety of puzzles in this game. In addition to a high quantity, the variety is quite good. For people who really like different kinds of puzzles, I think you'll find a wide selection here. The hint system, which I didn't show you, is reasonably good as well. You've got these 3 little booklets, hint 1, hint 2, and solution. Each box has its own set of 3. So when you're stuck on a puzzle, you'll be stuck on a specific card number for the puzzle. You would look it up in hint 1, you'd look up the number, and then you'd read a little bit of hint. And then if you still needed another hint, you'd look it up and look up hint 2 in the next booklet. And then if you just want the solution to the puzzle, you read it in the solution book. Now, they're uncomfortably tiny, but I mean, again, it's almost like it would have cost them more and be more effort for them to make these tiny little books than if they made a nice larger pamphlet. Personally, I would have preferred a larger font that was easier to read. You're going to need your reading glasses for this game. But these work reasonably well. The hints do help without giving away everything. The solutions are always full and explained. They're short, but they do explain the solution. Another really nice thing about this game is how it's broken up into sessions. The whole game is broken up into 10 chapters that feel nicely self-contained, of good length, an hour or 2 or 3, depending on how you play it. And then the 2-part system is quite nice too. You sort of are introduced to all these characters, and then you finally get to the part 2 where you get some resolution of some of them. It's actually a very nice structure. And the use of these 4-digit cards, although it's something we've seen quite a bit before, the combination of using these small cards, number-based, and then these larger components of these envelopes with larger pieces to work with, and then the idea that each of these is a room that's hiding this surprise inside when you open it, and you feel like, okay, I've opened it up, I get to see what's inside, I can look inside the room. It's all works together to be mechanically, structurally, a really compelling setup. Okay, so still focusing on the positive elements here, I want to talk a little bit about some of the more novel elements here that are so appealing, so exciting from a game design perspective. I've talked already about the rooms being these envelopes with double-sided so you can see the back. That's wonderful. The use of a map so you can spatially visualize where you are in this place. We've seen this in a couple puzzle games. I find this makes a huge difference to me. It's not very common. Most of these escape room games, puzzle games, you're basically just abstractly working through a story. Here you can see, okay, I'm in this room now, and then I went to this room. And the story does take you on a journey. Now, it would be, I'll come back to whether this was a little bit of a missed opportunity later. And I do think it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about how cool the framing of these storylines are. So there's 5 or 6 different storylines of different people who are trapped in this asylum, and you're playing them one at a time. So you've got like 5 or so little mini stories set in this larger world, universe, larger story. But one of the really cool things is that these characters you're controlling and playing and escaping are sort of doing their thing simultaneously. So you'll play one, and then when you play the other one, you'll sort of cross paths with what character you've previously played. And they're just these little cameos, these little sightings, these little elements where you see the crossover and you go, oh, that's cool, I did that there, or that's who I'm seeing there. It's fun, it keeps you on your toes, and when you're reading, it makes it all much more engaging. And then the overall arching story here of this place they're trying to escape. It's very common for these escape rooms to sort of be framed like you're trapped in here. But here there's a deeper, more interesting story promised, at least, which is that you're not just trapped by this villain in here. There's some overarching conspiracy mystery that you're trying to solve as you work your way through these 10 chapters. And over the course of 10 chapters, that suspense builds up a bit. I mean, you get curious. How is this going to end? What's the explanation for all this? What's really going on? Is there a bigger conspiracy at play? And I think that is compelling. There are also a couple of new mechanics that are really quite clever here. One of them is you occasionally, and it's very occasionally, you occasionally will get an object, either inside a room or in a card, that's got a symbol on it that says, you just keep this with you. So you're playing through a character, you go in a room, you find an object. Most of the rooms and puzzles are completely self-contained. You just get it, you solve it, you find the code, you move on. But occasionally you'll get an object that you just keep, that you're not ready to use yet, and you'll use later in a different puzzle or in a different part of the narrative. It's a great idea. It makes the puzzles potentially more interesting because you may come upon a puzzle that, well, it's not true that you're going to come on a puzzle that you could come back to because you don't get to choose where to go. Unlike other games, there are other puzzle systems like Deadbolt Mystery Society where you can choose what puzzle to attack in what order, and so you might find an object and say, oh, that goes with this puzzle. That can't quite happen here because you're not free to work on whatever you want. You're taken step by step through it. But it will be the case that you might get an object and you won't know when it's time to use it. And then there's something else that's very clever. That's the use of these special replacement cards. So in each box, there's a set of replacement cards here. There's just a few of them in box 1. There's more of them in box 2. And the way these work is you'll occasionally read a card or make a choice, and it'll say, okay, if you choose to do this, go get this card and swap it in. Replace the card that's originally in the deck with this one of these new red cards, and then discard the other one. All the cards you play, you only ever see once. And basically what it does is it allows actions you take to have future consequences. So you replace a card, and then later on in the game, in a subsequent chapter or later in the current chapter, when you go get a card, you find, oh, this is the red card. So I'm now seeing the consequence, the branching possibilities that happen because I did something else. It's a fantastic idea. It's a great addition to this card-based system. And it constantly creates this little suspense and surprise. Like you really want to get to those cards that are red to see how has my action affected anything. So there's that. So the last sort of really positive thing I want to recognize in this game is the promise of these branching narrative choices and the possibility of having different endings. So you've played these 10 chapters. You'll never play the game again after you've finished those 10 chapters. There'd be no reason to. But this isn't the first puzzle game that we've played where you've got a couple choices to make, and that may affect the ending you get. In here, it's not affecting necessarily a global final ending, but you might tweak a little bit the ending of each character in part 2, or I guess in part 1. So depending on your choices, you might see different little story endings in these cards. All the narrative is in this card. There's no narrative elsewhere. There's no narrative in here. There's no book narrative. But depending on your choices, you might theoretically get slightly different endings for your characters in here. And I'm going to return and spend some time talking about that in a little bit. Okay, now it's time for the bad news. I've talked about all the promises of the game, all of the very exciting elements, mechanical elements. But now it's time to peel back the curtain a little bit and see that things didn't quite turn out as one might hope. First, let's talk about the puzzles. And I need to say that this is a very subjective thing. Different people like different kinds of puzzles. Different people on a different day encounter a puzzle and say, that was amazing and challenging and I loved it and I love the solution. And other people hit it and they say, wow, that was not fun. And it can depend on your mood level, your energy, and just whether you were on the same wavelength. And I played this game on YouTube. You can watch all of our playthroughs with a bunch of experienced players at these games. And I would say, in general, we all agreed that there were a lot of problems with the puzzles. But some of us enjoyed more of them more than others. For me, this collection of puzzles were unusually frustrating and disappointing. For a number of reasons. One that we encountered over and over again was ambiguous puzzles. Remember, all of the solutions to puzzles have a 4-digit code. And we came across puzzle after puzzle where you could make a compelling case that, okay, it could be this sequence, or it could be this sequence, or it could be this sequence, depending on how you interpret the rules of what it wants for you, because all the puzzles are sort of framed in a way that's sort of not telling you exactly how to solve it. And that's sort of, it's almost like the puzzles are violating what I expect the rules of these puzzle games to be. And one of the rules is the puzzle should have an unambiguous solution. And when you figure it out, you're like, yep, that's it. I got it. I figured out what it's trying to get me to guess and what it wants. And when you get the solution, you just know it. It just makes so much sense. And here we had puzzle after puzzle where we're like, is that what it wants? Let's just look and see if we can find it. Yes, it was. All right. Or, nope, not that. Let's try this. Nope, not that. And tried 10 different things that all seemed reasonable. When we finally got the one it wanted, we were like, yeah, all right. All of the answers to the puzzles are plausible. They all make sense. It's just they're not unique. They're not unambiguous solutions given the puzzle. So that's the first thing. We hit that most often. Occasionally, occasionally when we played it live, we got to a puzzle where we were like, that's ridiculous, that's completely ambiguous. And then later we were like, all right, well, there was a little bit of hint here that was nudging us in one direction or another. But in general, I think that criticism holds. But there were other problems too. The game says very clearly you don't need the internet, you don't need your phone. This is an old school style game. We hit at least one puzzle where that was a total lie. And if you watch our playthrough, I think it was in chapter 2 or so, we basically spent 3 hours sitting there trying to solve this puzzle. And there were a bunch of times where we were like, well, maybe it wants this from us, but it can't because no one would know this information without looking it up on the internet. No one would know these specific numbers without doing research. But the game tells us we don't need to do that research, so that can't be the solution. And then after 3 hours or so, we eventually said, okay, let's look at the hints. And that was indeed exactly what it was. And then there's a thread on Board Game Geek of other people complaining about this same thing. So there was that. There are a bunch of puzzles that are very hard to do without writing on and manipulating and physically messing with the cards and the pieces. And that sort of ran contradictory to the game telling you that you don't need to modify any of the cards. I think you probably could get away with solving them just by visually imagining them in your head, but it would be very difficult. So probably for an occasional puzzle with this, you're going to want some tracing paper or scan it and draw on it, stuff like that. Maybe even scan it and cut something out. A little bit, I wouldn't call that really a frustration, just a little bit of a disconnect here. And then quite a few times we got to puzzles that were, frustration was a common theme here. If you watch the playthroughs, there were quite a few puzzles that generated a lot of frustration on my part. There were quite a few puzzles where they're like trying to save space. The explanation for what you should do is written just in the small text on a card. And there were a bunch of puzzles where the description of the task was very unclear and even occasionally contradicted pictures in the illustrations. So the card says it wants you to do one thing. You look at the pieces of the puzzle or the picture of the puzzle and you're like, that doesn't make sense. I don't understand what you're telling me to do. So I can't even try to solve your puzzle because I don't understand how to interpret what you're saying. There was a bunch of that, and that was very frustrating, and especially because it seems like they are really going for hard puzzles, and a bunch of puzzles were really overly convoluted, multi-step things, where you have to figure out three different convoluted things to get the right answer. And so there's sort of, in most puzzle games, it's trying to give you enough hints so that when you stumble on the right idea, you know it and you know how to resolve it. Here, it's sort of like you'd have to figure out these 3 things to do or 2 things to do. And if you figure out the first one, there's no way for you to know that you figured it out. Like there's no close, nothing clicks into place. And there were a couple puzzles like that felt like, wow, you didn't need to make this a 2-step convoluted thing. You've overly engineered this. You've overly complicated something. And so that was quite frustrating. Maybe in still focusing on puzzles, something that might be more subjective for you would be the nature of the puzzles. I would say for this box, for this game, many more sort of spatial visual illusion puzzles than I'm used to, or that I like for my taste. I prefer more logic puzzles, maybe a little bit mathematical, maybe a little bit more reasoning. And here there were a bunch of puzzles that relied on sort of visual spatial manipulation. And some people like that, so that might be good. But just in general, lack of guidance on how to solve these puzzles. So frequently sitting there and being like, don't understand what it wants, don't understand how to figure out if I'm on the right track. And when I get to the right answer, not sure if that's what it had in mind. So those are some problems with the puzzles. Now let's talk about problems with the narrative story elements. Most of the narrative here, if you saw in that beginning where we started playing a character and gave us a little bit of story, most of the narrative here is just sort of moment by moment describing how you get from one room to another. And it's not bad. You're like, oh, you see this, you just escaped, this person almost saw you, this person almost caught you, here's how you get from one room to the other. It's sort of narrative describing how you're moving through this asylum and what you're thinking. There's a little bit of an intriguing backstory for each of the 5 or 6 characters that is intriguing. Like, you do want to understand what's going on, how this person got here, what's going on with their life. So it does a reasonable job of doling out these little drips of their storyline. But ultimately, they're very minimally fleshed out. It's very minimal story that actually gets resolved. And the pacing of it all is very odd. It's sort of like all of the attention is on their moment to moment moving about the asylum. We get a little bit of piece of their backstory that intrigues us enough. And then just when it builds up our curiosity, it's a complete absence of any resolution, any satisfying narrative, any interesting epilogue. It's just not there. And if you are hoping for sort of an overarching explanation and narrative to what happens in this bigger picture, you're not going to get it. And I talk about a lot when we talk about these narrative games, where sort of the reward of playing a narrative game is a rewarding narrative conclusion. And here you get a very anticlimactic, minimal ending, almost like the game just stops abruptly, almost like you were watching a finale and James Bond is confronting the villain, and right when he bursts into the room, the game ends. The movie ends. Like, it was shocking to us when we got to the end. We were like, where is the rest of the story? Very flat, very bizarre. So that's sort of the narrative content. And now mechanically, there are also some real problems with the way the story unfolds. There are a couple of branching choices you make here. They're all feel completely arbitrary. There's no basis for you to pick one or the other. There's no way for you to tell what the right answer is. And the repercussions of making these choices are very arbitrary, unsatisfying, weird. It's sort of like choosing whether you want to exit through door A or door B. And if you pick door A, you get told it's a wooden door. And if you pick door B, you get told it's a concrete door. Like, okay, that's the payoff for this choice that feels like it should be weighty and important. It's weird. And then in the places where your choices does affect the story, it affects it in ways where we got to it and we said, well, I don't get it. I don't understand why my choice here led to this. Like, I don't even understand causally what caused this to happen. And when we got to the end and backed up and tried to look at some cards to try to understand it, we still couldn't really figure out what the designers had in mind. What was their philosophy for these choices? And even just occasionally, it felt like a character completely did a 180 on their own understanding of their motivations and life. And it was so minimal that we were just like, Okay, it doesn't really make sense. Maybe it's going to get resolved in the end. We were coming up with our own theories of how to explain all these inconsistencies, hoping that in the end there was going to be some explanation for them all, but there wasn't. Okay, some final thoughts and suggestions. Ultimately, I think this game is a story of missed opportunities. It's a generous box with some fantastic ideas, very well produced. Mechanically and structurally, all the pieces are here for a great game. But if the narrative was great, the bad puzzles could be excused. If the puzzles were great, the bad narrative could be excused. But here we've got a combination of really, in the end, I'm sorry to say, subpar puzzles and subpar narrative. And that's being generous. I really think in many ways these are, you know, not not good enough puzzles, not good enough narrative. The puzzles are frequently frustrating when they didn't need to be. It feels like just another couple rounds of development, cycles of editing with better instructions, maybe fewer puzzles. You really could have fine-tuned these to have them be satisfying. Maybe a better job of making close answers, have cards so the person would know they're on the right track. And then the narrative and branching choices were compelling. They sort of were suspenseful, but in the end, huge letdown. Almost like they just ran out of time and just said, forget it. We're not going to bother writing the endings for anything. So let me make a couple of suggestions. First of all, if you're playing the game, and there's a lot to like in here, and if you're curious about these kinds of games, there's a lot of bang for your buck. So I'm not saying don't buy this, and I'm not saying don't play it, and I'm not saying you might not love it. But let me make a couple of suggestions. First, I'm going to suggest something that I almost never suggest, which is when you get stuck on a puzzle for a little bit, if you find yourself getting a little bit frustrated, just go right to the hints. Now, normally, my thing is never read the hints. If a puzzle takes you all day, if it takes you 6 hours, just think of that as, wow, I'm getting 6 hours of gameplay out of this game. Don't try to churn through it as fast as possible. In this game, however, I really think that you could get into situations like we got in with our 3-hour work on a puzzle where we were never going to find the solution because it was an unreasonable solution and the puzzle was poorly designed. So I do suggest that if you get frustrated, go read the first hint, the second hint. Make sure you're on the right path. Make sure, or better yet, you're making sure that the designers aren't doing something that you consider unfair. That's the first piece of advice. Second piece of advice, don't try to marathon these sessions. They're nicely broken up into 10 chapters. Play one chapter at a time, then put the game away, come back to it later. Another piece of advice with lots of these games, expectations are really, with these narrative and mystery games, very often expectation is king. Expectation determines whether you're going to be positively surprised or disappointed. And I would set my expectations for narrative satisfaction very low. Do not expect to be satisfied by the narrative going on here. You can enjoy the process, the fact that there is a little string of narrative, but if you're hoping to have things figured out or solved or even just being satisfied emotionally with an ending scene, don't. You're not going to get it. And then I would say lastly, the way I do with many of these games, just ignore the scoring stuff. It just seems like for this game, the scoring penalizes you for checking the hints. I mean, I just think in this game you would be well advised to, when you think you got a guess of an answer, just look it up, try to find the card, and do it multiple times. Don't worry about looking for an answer on a hunch. Just look it up. Save yourself some time. For designers, a couple of suggestions. First of all, I would say lean into the use of a map And the objects that you find in one room that you might use in a future puzzle, those were fun elements. They were very rarely used and rarely involved any thinking on our part on any decisions. But I think when it did, it sort of elevated the game from a puzzle game to almost like a little computer adventure game. And I think that they would be well advised to double down on that kind of stuff. I would lean into this wonderful element of the overlapping timelines and the idea that some choices can affect the next chapter with these cards that get replaced. I mean, I think that was one of the most enjoyable aspects of the game mechanically, and also sort of narratively fun to run into each other, into the different characters you're playing. And I think doubling down on that and making more interactions between them would be more satisfying. I think you need to completely revisit the way that you're wrapping up these stories. If it's a game with a substantial narrative component, it needs to have a narrative conclusion that's satisfying. There needs to be an overarching story solution, story epilogue, maybe put it in a booklet if you can't fit it on cards, and little wrap up for the characters that's more satisfying, fuller and more satisfying. And then, of course, the puzzles need to be less frustrating. I think they need more playtesting. They need to be less ambiguous. And the instructions, the explanation, the framing of the puzzle needs to be better so that the player knows what the instructions mean, what constraints are being conveyed to the player. They need to be understandable. Make the parts that the player's supposed to figure out and puzzle over, that's fine. You can make those as hard as you want. But if your instructions are supposed to be clear, if you're explaining what they're looking at and they're supposed to understand that, you have to do a better job. There you have it. I hope you got something out of this review. You can watch our playthroughs. If you do find this useful, I'd love for you to hit the like button. And I would love to hear if you disagree with me about this game. I suspect some people will disagree with me about whether the puzzles worked for them or not. Love to hear your thoughts. Love to hear anything you think I missed out on that I didn't understand, or maybe you found it more frustrating than I did. You can leave your comments below, and I'll see you on the next video.